Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a deeply hidden, unfolding crisis. It's a story of structural collapse. And we're not looking at opinions here. We're looking at cold, hard demographic math. We're investigating a state caught in the grip of a demographic death spiral. And this matters deeply because when a global superpower experiences a rapid contraction of its population, the resulting economic instability and geopolitical shifts create tremors that are felt across the entire world. We're going to use the data, and in some cases the sudden glaring absence of data, to understand exactly what is happening to the Russian population.
So here's a question for you. Why did a global superpower suddenly stop counting its own people? I mean, in any modern state, statistics are the absolute bedrock of governance. You kind of need to know who's being born, who's dying, and who actually makes up your workforce, right? But what happens when a government intentionally hides those exact survival metrics? Well, a government usually only hides these numbers when they reveal a reality it simply cannot afford its own country or the rest of the world to see.
And as you'll see, the erasure was incredibly systematic. Back in March of 2025, the government quietly stopped publishing monthly birth and death stats. Just poof, gone. Then, by late 2025, marriage and divorce data was slashed. It was released only once a quarter and actively rounded to the nearest 100, just to obscure the details. And then we hit July 2026, and a massive purge happened. Federal agencies literally pulled 140 public data sets and completely stopped updating 425 statistical indicators. Demographic data took the absolute hardest hit.
Now, take a look at this number, negative 596,200. In 2024, which was the very last clean year of data before this whole blackout started, deaths outnumbered births by almost 600,000. That is a massive jump, up more than 20% from the year before. Just visualize that for a second. That's the equivalent of an entire mid-sized city being completely erased in just 12 months. And crucially, that is the exact figure the state decided to stop publishing right after. All right, let's move into part one of this breakdown. 3 circles of certainty, measuring the casualties of war. While the official numbers are suppressed, we can actually view the reality of the ongoing war through widening circles of statistical probability. Starting on the conservative end, over 227,000 individuals have been independently named and confirmed by journalists who are literally just cross-checking obituaries. Moving outward from there, you've got 352,000 casualties modeled directly from internal inheritance and probate records. And finally, Western intelligence estimates are approaching 500,000 killed, putting total casualties at over 1 million. Honestly, no matter which of these metrics you trust, you're looking at the largest hole ever torn into one generation of Russian men in peacetime memory. But here's the thing. This casualty burden is absolutely not shared equally. If you look at Tuva, which is the poorest republic in the country, the death rate is running at an astonishing 476 per 100,000 people. Buridia sits at 400 per 100,000. But contrast this with the megacities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, which remain largely untouched. Cities with over 100,000 people house more than half the country's population, but they account for only a third of the fatalities. So the data objectively shows a state utilizing its poorest, most ethnically non-Russian provinces to protect its capital.
This brings us to part 2. Nobody is being born. The birth rate collapse. So let's shift our focus to the other half of this demographic spiral, because it has profound consequences for the nation's long-term survival. It's a really cruel arithmetic. The exact same young men dying at the front are the generation needed to father the next one. In 2025, total births hit 1.178 million. And that isn't just a low number, it actually marks the absolute lowest annual count in modern Russian history, plunging right past the previous record lows we saw in 1999 and 2006.
And we aren't just talking about a temporary dip here or a quick pause in family planning. We are talking about 11 straight years of decline. It breaks the demographic birth floor that had held steady for 200 years. When a floor collapses to this degree, it tells us we're looking at a deep structural shift in the foundation of the society, not just some passing economic bump in the road. Now, the governance response to this reveals a pretty stark disconnect. Officially, we're seeing this legislative theater, new laws banning so-called child-free propaganda, and officials urgently telling citizens they need to have 3 kids by age 35. But get this, they're funding maternity payment programs at a mere 0.25% of their GDP. Contrast that with the reality on the ground over on the right. Survey data shows that only 2 to 3% of Russians actually say they don't want children.
So the state is aggressively targeting a group that barely even exists, all while the birth numbers just continue their free fall quarter after quarter.
Okay, moving on to part 3, the mass exodus. Everyone with a choice is leaving. The third compounding factor in this collapse is a massive brain drain. Check out this number. Between 650,000 and 900,000 people emigrated in 2022 alone. And we're not talking about just a random slice of the population here. These are the engineers, the doctors, the programmers. This is the highly educated workforce who packed up, moved to cities like Yerevan and Almaty, and just never came back. When the demographic that's most capable of leaving actually does leave, a country's economic engine inevitably stalls out.
And you have to contrast that massive exodus with this terrifying deficit rate here, 10.9 million. That is the exact number of workers that Russia's own labor minister admitted directly to the government that the economy needs to import by 2030, literally just to stand still. This isn't some outside think tank's forecast, okay? This is an internal, on-the-record admission about the massive hole they're standing in. You just cannot lose hundreds of thousands of your brightest minds, send a generation to the front lines, and then expect your factories and hospitals to keep running.
Which leads us to our final section, part 4, the century forecast and the end of the spiral.
So what actually happens when you map this exact trajectory out over the coming decades? Well, officially, the population count appears stable today, but it's a lie of omission. That stability relies entirely on padding the domestic numbers, using the populations of annexed Ukrainian territories. And tragically, those territories have lost half of their own people since 2022. So annexed land is essentially being officially counted just to mask the reality that the nation is rapidly losing its own citizens.
But if you strip away that padding, we arrive at the United Nations long-run forecast. If you remove the annexed territories and just follow the current birth, death, and emigration rates, Russia's population is projected to fall to somewhere between 74 and 120 million people by the year 2100. Just let that sink in. That means this nation is on track to potentially lose half of its current population by the end of the century.
As the data clearly shows, this is a country running out of the one resource no government can print more of. You can mandate new laws, you can suppress the data, and sure, you can change the borders on a map, but you cannot simply legislate a population back into existence. So it leaves us with this huge question. What does the ultimate fate of a shrinking empire actually look like when the math simply no longer adds up?